This is Steve from the Art Box. With me today is Sandi Randell, and we're here to interview Christy Kendall, author of the newly released and exciting mystery, Erie Ending.
Welcome to the Art Box, your podcast dedicated to exploring the vibrant art scene in Nevada and beyond. Join us as we embark on a journey through galleries, theaters, studios, public lands, and streetscapes, meeting the artists, curators, archaeologists, nature lovers, and cultural influencers who shape our creative community and our world. Whether you're looking for your next cultural adventure, seeking inspiration for your own artistic pursuits, or simply curious about the world of art, tune into the Art Box. Together, let's open up a world of creativity and imagination. Let's dive in.
So, Christy, your book, Erie Ending, looks like it's taken off. It's been out a month or so. I've read it. Sandi's read it. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got started?
Okay. As you know, I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 25 years. I started out as a GS7 wildlife biologist in Meadows, California. Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge was actually my second job. And going from, I grew up in Phoenix and I went to school in southern New Mexico and been in one desert or another most of my life. And moving to Ottawa was a very different experience for me. It rained there. It rained a lot. I fell in love with that refuge. It was a steep learning curve for me as a biologist. And I just thought, this is such a cool place. And as I continued working for refuges and traveled across the country, I just sort of fell in love with all the people who volunteer, who give their time, who work for the agency, who really care about what they're doing. And I thought, I've always wanted to write. And instead of writing that James Michener epic poem that I had in my mind, I thought I could probably reach new audiences if I wrote about refuges in a murder mystery genre. And that's what I started learning how to do about 20 years ago.
Addie the Art Box down under research assistant jumping in here with some details of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service is a federal agency within the Department of the Interior dedicated to the conservation, protection, and enhancement of America's fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats. Established in 1940, the agency plays a central role in enforcing federal wildlife laws, conserving endangered species, restoring fisheries, and managing the National Wildlife Refuge System, which includes more than 560 national wildlife refuges and 38 wetland management districts across the United States. These refuges protect over 850 million acres of land and water, offering critical habitat for thousands of species and providing opportunities for public recreation and environmental education. With a mission rooted in science, stewardship, and public engagement, the USFWS works to ensure that future generations can experience and benefit from the nation's rich natural heritage. Christy, I know Steve and Sandi have been anxious to schedule this podcast, and I am excited to hear the story of your journey as an author. Addie, over and out.
Wonderful. You had in your guest survey, when we asked you about theme, you said you had a great line. People and the hard work they do are what conservation is all about. And as you mentioned, you said you tell the stories of the employees, the volunteers, and the nonprofits who give their time and money to support conservation through your writing. Are most of your characters based on actual people you've known, or are they more composites of your fellow conservationists?
Oh, they're composites. There's the only thing that's real about the stories I write are the places. And biology as much as I can make it accurate as possible. Okay. Sometimes I blow it, and the management, some of the management stuff. I know that people don't really always understand or know what happens on a national wildlife refuge or a national park for that matter. But most of what we do depends on volunteers. Most refuges I've worked at are severely understaffed. They're in your backyard, Desert National Wildlife Refuge. 1.5 million acres, has maybe 2-3 employees at any given time, and that's fully staffed. Everything else depends on volunteers, and we're lucky. We get them.
Gwen and I, on our first day at Ash Meadows, we were the only people on the refuge. Everyone else was gone.
Wow.
We felt quite important.
Yes, you
I
were.
can imagine, yes.
That is something that throughout my career, some of my best friends were volunteers who worked for me. I have to say, they had great ideas. I let them take the lead on many things because they were people who had had other life experiences and they were able to bring that in with it. But they loved what they did, and I loved having them there. They were like family. So yes, volunteers are extremely important to public lands management just about anywhere.
In Erie Ending, you certainly focused on the volunteers. The volunteers were front and center.
Yes. You also mentioned that you started the book with your experiences doing frog surveys when you started writing it, and that's how the book actually starts. How did your personal experiences working on the refuges shape the narrative of this particular story?
Of this particular story, well, I did, as a biologist, I did frog surveys. As a biologist, I actually monitored all of the eagle nests that are mentioned. I'm able to write about my personal experiences through other characters. You know, I have multiple characters doing many of the things that I did on a refuge. And I think that adds a little bit of credibility to the story, even though it's fictional. I mean, I assure you, murders aren't happening on refuges, and it's very rare that anyone is trying to do an illegal real estate deal with us or anything, but I had to come up with some reason to kill someone. But it is not unusual to sometimes find dead bodies on refuges. It simply isn't. Sometimes they are remote places that are convenient for suicides, or people get lost or hurt. On Ottawa, actually, a person was found dead in a car who'd had a heart attack on the highway and went off the road and wasn't found for 2 weeks because he was down in a ditch and completely covered by brush.
Oh, my.
So, you know, these things, it is something that happens. And I think if you talk to BLM rangers or park rangers, you're going to find that's kind of a common theme across the country.
What was the strangest or most unusual thing that you ever encountered on a refuge, aside from a dead body, which I hope you didn't find?
The strangest or most unusual thing I found at Ottawa, I would say to you, the first time I saw a snapping turtle come to the surface of the water, okay, I thought, what the heck is that? I mean, they are some gruesome looking things. And you'll know in chapter 4 or 5 there where the prehistoric snout comes to the surface. That was probably a remembrance of that first time I saw something like that. Nature is odd itself. So people do unexpected things all the time, but sometimes you can really be surprised when you're just outdoors and paying attention.
Christy, when did you go to Ottawa? And I assume you went there directly from Needles?
Oh, yeah. I went to college when I was 30 years old, and I graduated with a master's degree when I was 37. And I started working at Havasu when I was 37. So I went when I was about 40, 41. I wasn't a spring chicken. I was an older adult with teenage kids and everything else. And this was in about 2000, the year 2000. So it was well over 20 years ago that I went to Ottawa. And in my successive stories, and I have 2 more books coming out, and they sort of tie together. They happen at other refuges, but you're going to meet some of the same characters again. I have to catch the reader up to where, for instance, Ottawa is today. When I was working there, we were in an old duck club. We worked with a lot of, the refuge just wasn't as developed as it is today. Now they have a nice big visitor center. They have solar panels everywhere. They have trails. So they have all kinds of cool stuff they didn't have when I was there. As I said, that was my second job with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Was that your first experience back east?
Yes. Yes, it was. It was my first experience going anywhere near the Great Lakes. And that's why I said it was just all a surprise to me, everything. I did enjoy it. I thought the place was beautiful. I wrote about it a little bit in the book, that the landscape is continually trying to turn into a swamp again. And I don't know how many people realize that I think the western United States was settled long before some of those areas around Lake Erie were, because they were so swampy. No one could build anything in there. And I learned that's where the word corduroy, they use the word corduroy to describe roads, that they would cut down trees and lay logs in the muck and drive on it until the trees sank, and then they would continually just add layers of tree trunks and drive on them, and that was called a cord road, a corduroy road. And there was one area near the refuge where they had discovered that one of those roads went 150 feet deep. I tried to tip my hat, too, to the French fur trade culture in that area. There are a lot of descendants of French fur traders in the area, and I worked with some of those. I did manage a trapping program on the refuge. So, like I said, a lot of it was from experience, but not. I, of course, created fictional characters to replace real ones, more or less.
One of the topics that you highlight in Erie Ending is the ongoing struggle between the conservationists and the land developers. And I was curious as to how much of that you encountered personally, and how did it affect your character development? Are any of the developers based on people that you knew again? Or
yeah, the only thing that I dealt with in that vein was that everybody wants to live near the lakefront. Everyone wants land or a home on the waterfront, and I think there isn't a state in the union that doesn't have to deal with this. And there were conservationists who were saying, look, stop building new homes in places where wildlife can be found. Let's preserve some of those areas. Let's start consolidating. During the time that I worked there, mitigation banks were kind of new on the scene. So what conservationists were trying to get developers to do was, if they developed wildlife habitat and made a home there, then they had to pay into a mitigation bank that would clean up some other portion of land, contaminants, things like that, to make it more available to wildlife. And there was a strong push in the environmental community for housing and things to be more consolidated into more urban areas, and to not sprawl so much, to not lose land to wildlife and natural places. But as far as developers, to the point that I wrote about it, that was entirely fictional. Yeah, okay. I just thought that sounded like a good plot. So here we go.
I didn't know if you were maybe, burning someone in effigy there or not with Connie King. I will ask, you said that most of your characters are composites rather than based on anyone in particular. Are there any characters that you particularly identify with as you're writing the story? Anything
okay.
Based on you?
Well, I think I probably identify very much with Lily in this story, being an older woman. And although I've never worked for the Air Force or done any of those things, and I think a little bit of me is probably in a few characters. I know what it's like to be Angela and to have issues come up on a refuge, and you have to be the one to deal with it. But I would say if I identified with anyone the most, it would be Lily, probably, in this story. And you'll see that in the second story. Lily is the main protagonist, and it takes place at Pahranagat National Wildlife Refuge. Huh? And I really identify with a lot of her experiences because, again, personal experiences I had, getting lost in the desert, things like that, come up in that book.
Oh, wow. Are all of you mentioned your future projects were set in some diverse locations like Nevada, West Virginia, Washington State. Are these all based on refuges that you've worked at?
So far, the first 3 books in this series are places I've either worked or I have spent a lot of time. The 4th book, which I don't have under contract yet, is at a refuge I've never worked at, and it is a lot more difficult to write about a place you haven't really experienced. So I'm kind of playing around with going back to, I've worked in San Francisco Bay, I've worked in the desert quite a bit, I've worked at in the Midwest in prairie refuges, and I'm toying with that. But I'm also thinking about writing about the federal duck stamp. I really love that program. And I've written one story that I've not shown to anyone yet that I'm real pleased with, and I'm thinking I might branch off in that direction too. I love the artists who deal with that program.
Yeah, and I think that we did an episode with Jen, and Rob drove up to Mesquite, and we did an Artbox episode on the federal duck stamp.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in Nevada, I ran the junior duck stamp program for that period of time, and I loved it. I loved how the kids could get so involved. Every kid knows what a duck looks like, and if you want to explain conservation at a basic level, talk about ducks and what ducks need. And pretty much you can cover the gamut of what everything else needs once you start with that. And it's just an easy way to reach children, to reach adults. And it's a beautiful, you can get some beautiful artwork out of it, or fun art, if nothing else. I mean, we had some real interesting entries at Desert when we did it there. I can't, some of them made me laugh out loud. They were funny.
Yeah, and they were, the ones, of course, the ones I would see would be at Paranagit, and they were all real good. Actually, there'd be kids in second grade that would have just beautiful work. It's like, no, they can't be in second grade.
There are some kids who are extremely talented. And if they're not that talented at drawing, they're very imaginative. There was one that had ducks flying helicopters and netting other ducks. So it was like, okay, this kid's got something on his mind. But yeah, I write these stories because I want people to know a little bit more about refuges, what they're about. Most people don't know what a national wildlife refuge is. They know what a national park is, or they think you work for the state. Always, it seemed to me that this was something that I could write about. I think one of the nicest things I've heard so far was from a refuge person who is now retired, said it was an enjoyable book because they were back on a refuge again. And I thought, that's what I want you to do. I want to take you to these places where I've worked, and I want you to meet the kind of people that I worked with. I want you to get to know them because they're not lazy federal workers. They're not people who are bored and have nothing to do, who volunteer. These are people who care about what is going on the planet, and they want to help in one way or another. I just thought, nobody knows anything about this. I need to write about it. And I love to read murder mysteries. So I thought, I'll combine the two.
You mentioned that you were influenced by Agatha Christie and Nevada Barr, and I particularly liked your comment that your mom bought you all the Hardy Boys books, because I had the full set of the hardback blue Hardy Boys books right next to my yellow Nancy Drews that my dad bought for me. And I feel like kids today are missing out not having those on their bookshelves.
Well, I too had every Hardy Boys book. My mother bought me every one of them. I didn't read Nancy Drew, but I read Trixie Belden. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Yes.
Yeah, I read every Nevada Barr, too. And the first Nevada Barr book read was Superior Death. And I thought, doggone it, she wrote my book. I thought, no, she didn't. No, she didn't. I can do it about refuges. There we go. But yeah, I enjoyed her. My favorite Nevada Barr was Blind Descent, where she goes down into Carlsbad Caverns. Because I've been into Carlsbad Caverns so many times, and I could smell that cave when I read her book. It was like, wow, I'm there. Ooh.
I can smell that cave and feel the humidity right now. Just you talking about it,
I think that's what I love about reading, is you can go so many places.
Yeah, and you never have to leave your living room. I did want to ask about your process. You mentioned your beta readers, and I thought you had a really interesting mix of viewpoints. You said you had three male beta readers who didn't work in conservation and 3 women who did. And I was curious, as did you have specific individuals in mind when you put that group together? Did it develop organically, or how did you decide on those 6 people?
It developed organically. It started with one woman who worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then when I moved up here to Washington, I didn't realize I had family in the area, and I met my cousin. His name is Bob. He said, "Oh, you're a writer. I would love to read what you write." And I said, "Aha, well, only if you're willing to be brave and give me comments and not be afraid to insult me." And he said, "No, I can do that." So it started with one woman and one man. And then Jessica is another beta reader. She works for Fish and Wildlife Service. She ran my duck stamp program with me at Paranagit. And I don't know if you ever met her, Jessica Samuelson. She was an intern for a long time. She finally got a job with the service.
Yeah, I did not.
Okay. Well, now she's working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and she ran the junior duck stamp program for Arizona. So she's a beta reader. And then when I wrote the duck stamp book that you'll see someday, I asked Suzanne Fellows, who was the coordinator for the federal duck stamp contest, if I could volunteer for her and help her with the contest one year so that I could host it in Las Vegas when we had it there. And she wanted to read my books as well. So I got her on board. So that just sort of happened through the service. But Bob was the only man outside of it. And then I met another woman writer here whose husband said he liked to read mysteries. And then he was reading the book, and he was talking to his neighbor who said, "Oh, I want to read that." So that's how I got the three guys. It just kind of grew on its own. And I said, "Okay, I'm going to stop there. I don't want any more beta readers. I'm good." You can get a lot of different comments that way, though. I mean, it really surprised me, some things. And that being said, I still pay a developmental editor who she's brilliant. I pay a line editor who also calls out different things that in my writing. And with all of those people looking at it, when I send a book into my publisher, I still have major revisions to do. So it's like, if you want to write, it's not about just writing a story. You better like rewriting. You better like polishing. You better like finding new words to use instead of the ones that they don't like. And that is something, luckily, I like the revision process because to me, it's like, ooh, that's a better idea. I didn't think of that. Let me work that out. Let me add that. Let me do this. I could go on and on ad nauseum editing. I really could. You got to really break my hand and make me stop. The hardest part for me is getting the story out in the first place in a plausible manner. Because honestly, I couldn't imagine personally killing anybody for any reason. I mean, to go that far. So to come up with a plausible murder, a good reason for someone to kill someone and make it sound real is difficult for me. I know that people will kill you for 10 cents if that's what they're after. Some people, I mean, it's nothing for some people. But in my mind, somebody has to really be nuts or really angry about something. So, that's the hardest part for me. And then writing a story around it. But once I get that story out, oh man, I let it rest for about a week, and then I come back and I'm ready. I'm ready to get the old red ink out and start polishing,
Well, I guess I'll ask both of you. Don't you have to have thick skin if somebody reads your book and starts criticizing you?
Oh yeah, you can't. You can't take it personally. They're not criticizing you. They're criticizing your work, and that can be personal, or can feel personal rather.
If you become if you're going to get published, like Sandy just said, you have to have that thick skin. I look at it this way: it's just words. If you don't like those, I have more.
Well, that's a good attitude. See, I would go away. I would go away and cry. I couldn't take it.
Well, and there are a lot of folks who do, and that's what I try to tell folks. They're not criticizing you. They're trying. If they're doing it well, they're trying to help you. I mean, some people are just snarky. They don't want to help you. They just want to criticize. But if you choose people who really care about helping you, then they are honest. And I do ask people. I say, I'm asking you to read it and tell me what's not believable. Tell me where you stop reading. Tell me where it's boring. I don't really need wordsmithing at this point because I'm not at that point of writing. I need to know if the book is going to work. And I have one friend, she works for the service. Her name is Fran, and she was in visitor services. She always tells me, she says, Christy, way too much biology in here. This is really boring. And I look at her and I say, biology? Boring? In the same sentence? Fran.
Impossible.
See, and
Impossible.
I have a male friend who tells me I put too many love scenes in my books. So he says,
there we go.
Don't do that.
Well, and Sandi, I admire you if you can write those, because I can't.
There's definitely a certain level of bravery also involved in writing scenes like that, because you're putting yourself out there in a way that you don't in just a regular course of storytelling. Yeah, you're talking about something very intimate and everything. And I do have a lot of love scenes, depending on which book you read. Some have more than others. So no, I was told I was too lovey-dovey in Chasing Shadow. So.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Now, see, this, just like you asked me how much of this is my personal experience, that's why I kind of can't get into that, because I start wondering, what kind of questions are people going to ask me? But my husband always volunteers that if I don't want to write a love scene, he'll be glad to do it for me.
That's nice.
And I tell him, no, dear, we don't want smut. Get out of here.
So today I had a great question I was going to ask you. I got home and I told my wife I had a question I want to ask Christy, and I can't remember what it is now.
Oh, no.
And it was the love scene things, okay? Because, and I don't know whether you've met Brian yet, Sandi here. He's 95 years old, and he's written a couple novels. And there's one novel that I read, it was a love scene in it, right? And so what gives? How did you do that? You know, so that's what I was going to ask you. Would you do a love scene? But I don't have to ask that now.
Okay, so the only love scene that I have, I think, is when Angela goes home and she's upset and overwhelmed, and she falls into LJ's arms, and all she wants to do is forget.
Yeah.
Then I end the scene.
I thought that was I thought that was a very you told us what happened without telling us what happened, and I thought that was well done.
That's the way I write love scenes. Is whatever happens is in your mind now. It's up to you. You can carry it as far as you want to. No, and then the next scene is they're having popcorn or something. I don't know. Always food.
Neither of us write romance novels, so we don't need to get into details with it. So.
Yeah. And I have to say, I admire people who write romance. The saying goes around mystery writers that mystery writers are just nicer people because we have already aired all our grievances on paper.
I was going to say, wait, the ones who kill people for a living are the nicer ones.
Yeah. There we go. We get all that aggression out on in those words.
That's a good point.
You know.
So, Christy, when you retired, I remember when you retired, and I remember because we're Facebook friends. You know, you were moving up north, Pacific Northwest, and you were going to write a novel. I think you said right away, I'd be writing a novel, and it took a couple of years. And as I remember, you were going to various classes, and you were going out of town to other conferences and things. And so do you think that were you worried that it was too slow for you, or was it just right?
I think I've come late into a lot of things in life. I started my career with Fish and Wildlife Service when I was 37, you know. So what happened to me was, and I'm going to borrow a quote from computer programmers. I do this, Steve, not because it's easy, but because I thought it would be easy. Okay? I honestly believed when I first started writing, oh man, I can do this. I'm going to get after it. And quickly found that people just were looking at this stuff and not real impressed. And I moved to San Francisco Bay after I left Neil Smith Refuge. And this was in about 2003. And they had a writers' conference at a local bookstore. And that was the first time I really thought, wow, let me go see what this is all about. It's for writers who write mysteries. So I went and I was blown away. I thought, holy cow, I didn't know all this stuff. And what was wonderful is people like Michael Connolly were there, Reese Bowen, John Lasqua, you know, people like that. There were only about 70 people in this conference. They would sit with you one-on-one and give you consultations. They would read the first 20 pages of your writing and tell you specifically what you were doing wrong. I was just absolutely blown out of the water. And I realized after that I need to go to more of these because I'm not a person who can do tutorials. I cannot go to classes for everything. God, that would, it would take forever. So I started going to writer craft conferences. And at every one of them, I would do consultations. And you pay for those.
Yeah.
It's like $90. They read 20 pages and they sit with you for about an hour, 2 hours and tell you, what you're doing wrong or what you're doing right. I can tell you once said to me, told me the start to Erie Ending, the way I had written it at one point on one of those revisions, was just boring. No one would care. Why would anyone care? It nearly brought me to tears, not because it hurt my feelings, but I was so embarrassed that someone like would look at this and tell me how boring it was. And I walked away and I thought, well, that was a gift. Thank you. Because the truth was I had written originally this story very close to how I started it, with just a short little thing about someone getting killed. And then I went into my frog surveys. Of course, at that point, they were probably much longer ad nauseum surveys, but I had changed the beginning of it to do something else because of a critique that I had gotten from a group. That's when I realized that I started using beta readers instead of going to critique groups, and everyone is different, okay?
That's true.
I can't do critique groups, and so that you know what that is, as you're writing something, every time you write a few chapters, you give it to this group of other writers, and they read it, and then they each give you a critique on it. The problem with that is, that for me, is that I'm real ADHD, and it's real easy for me to get sidetracked, and I'll go different directions. Too many good ideas, and I'm off running somewhere else. And I realized, no, I need to sit down and write that book, good or bad, and get it done, rewrite it to the best of my ability, and then hand it off to someone to critique. Because now I know I can change parts of it and so forth, but I'm not going to completely go off the wagon. I mean, there were just little learning things like that. David Hewson, wonderful writer. He's from England. He does some wonderful stuff. Anyway, he does this wonderful series, an Italian policeman. And he told me, he said, Christy, your writing is very good as far as place. He said, I can feel that bloody swamp all over me when I'm reading this, but your story is dying on the page. Something needs to happen. And that's, it's just little things like that, the learning process. And yes, as Sandy said, you better start getting a thick skin, because if you keep going, you'll learn. If you can't take the criticism, you won't learn and you won't move forward. And that's what it's all about. And that's kind of life, isn't it?
At the same time, though, I do have to say, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, you just described it actually, if somebody makes a comment that does provoke, that gets past your thick skin and does provoke an emotional response and causes you to look at whatever it was that they didn't like, or, really did like in some cases, you can use that to inspire you to go in and fix it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It makes you a better writer because you think, okay, well, how could I fix this? How can I show this person that, yeah, I can do this and do it well? And that's very motivating.
And exactly. And to me, I'm an achiever. It's all about achieving that next level. But what you just said, maybe sometimes your readers will point out something and they kind of not sure, but they, this part, it made me stop and reread it 3 or 4 times. I don't know what's wrong here. I think it's this, or I think it's that. And I look at it and I can see immediately then, aha, I know what it is. Or they'll suggest something and I realize, okay, I could do that, but I think it'd be better if I did this. It just makes your brain open up. It gives you new windows of opportunity to make it better. I absolutely love the editor I have with my publisher. Sometimes it's a lot of hard work, but she helps me make that book better. And I like that collaborative sort of interaction. to me, it's not insulting. It's fun.
Yeah. And all critiques are valuable. Definitely. No?
No, I couldn't do it. Don't critique it. Nobody critique the podcast. I'll cry. I'll quit.
Words are not precious, Steve. There's so many of them out there. You know, you can't think your words are precious if you're gonna move forward. And I think, you know, I have been asked, are you traditionally published? For me, that was the goal, because I knew that if I just published myself, I don't know what I was putting out there. I needed that vetting. I needed someone else to say, okay, you're ready now. I know that sounds kind of goofy, but...
No, not at all. Okay, I have a totally fun question for you now. And I always stump everybody with this one, and I really don't mean to. If they were going to make a movie out of Erie Ending, who would you want to see cast as your lead characters?
Oh, I can tell you right away.
Oh,
Angie
perfect.
Harmon.
I'm sorry?
Angie Harmon.
Angie Harmon. Okay.
Yeah, from Risolian Isles. Because your question, I learned also at one of these conferences from a guy named Tony Broadbent, who writes a wonderful series, too, about a cat burglar during World War II in London. It's called The Smoke, his series. Anyway, he said whenever he has trouble writing a character, he thinks of an actor or an actress, and he starts developing it around that. And his character he developed around Michael Caine. And I thought, I read that book and he nailed it. It's Michael Caine. And so now when I'm writing a character and I can't think, but you know, if I can't get that character nailed down, then I think of an actress or an actor and I start building it around my image of that person and what I think they would do.
Okay, so there were two other characters that really stood out to me that I'd love to know who you would cast in your movie. Connie was one of them, obviously, and the other was Tony.
Everybody likes Tony.
Yeah, he's an interesting character.
You know, I don't know about Tony. Connie, I had thought of a Grace Kelly type image. That's who I said in the book she could have been Grace Kelly, except she had a hard demeanor. Tony, I don't know. He's kind of a wiry guy, and that one would stump me. I could tell you Jack Dumas was, I dedicated the book to a friend of mine who is gone now, but Jack Dumas looks a lot like what Kirk Russell looks like today in the face. Because my friend kind of looked like that. So I could do that. But geez, I have to think about Tony. He did catch me on that one. I can visualize him, but I don't know who would play him, because I'm not up on current movies. Maybe. What's the dude who does Matrix?
Oh, Keanu Reeves?
Yeah, Keanu Reeves. Maybe.
Okay.
Can you see that?
I can see that. I was thinking kind of an older Lou Diamond Phillips kind of look. With him.
Shorter too.
Yeah.
But that's right now off the top of my head, Sandy. That's
lovely. Okay, perfect.
That's my favorite question that you ask.
That's my favorite question to ask.
Because we sit around the campfire, that's what we talk about. You know, if this, who would it be? And that's, yeah.
I hope you enjoyed the book, and I hope that you'll enjoy the next one since it's kind of in your neighborhood.
Oh, yeah. What does Rob think about you coming onto his refuge?
Oh, Rob Vincent, he hasn't read the book. I told him that he's not in it, but he might recognize some of the things that he does.
Yeah.
You know, again, it's stuff he does. I had a friend ask me about Erie Ending, which character am I? And it was a guy who taught me how to drive every tractor on the refuge, who taught me how to drive airboats, who taught me how to do GPS. And I said, Stan, you're no one character. You're kind of spread all over the place. So that's how Rob is. You'll meet Lily again, because she's the main character in the next story. And Gilbert, you'll meet him again. He is the manager at Paranagit.
Yeah, he's the one that moved to Paranagit, right? Got a promotion.
Yeah, and so you'll see him again, and Lily follows him because she's got that camp trailer, and she has those 2 dogs, and she's going to become a RV volunteer.
Oh, geez, I think I know where she'll park at, too.
Yeah. It's right where you took that picture, and I'm hoping they use that. So I will tell you this. You asked me what surprises me. Something kind of unrelated. I can't write characters about people I know. It just doesn't work, okay? Like I said, I can just create all these characters and have them do things that many people I knew did. But every once in a while, I meet someone who was a character I already wrote. Jim Messenger in Erie Ending, I met him in San Francisco Bay years later. We had a kid come in. He was an intern working for us, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's him.
Yeah.
And at Paranagit, I met Lily. If you ever met Gail Ritter, she was a volunteer there, and she's passed away now too. But I told her, I said, I wrote a character who's a little bit like you. She's in a camp trailer traveling around by herself, and she's a widow. And she said, and she shared a book with me from Nevada Bar. So she gave me a little quote that I'm using at the beginning of that book. That sometimes surprises me when I meet people that I think, wow, you're just like a character I wrote. It's like the reverse of what you think. I don't write about real people, but I meet real characters sometimes.
Well, if you ever do decide to base a character on someone I can almost guarantee they won't recognize themselves when they read their book. I've based a number of characters on friends and acquaintances, and when they've read the book, they've never... If they do guess, they always guess wrong.
Oh, I think I know one.
Steve's got you. Yeah. Now I
You
have
know who I'm talking about.
I know you're talking
Because you
about.
told him, he's like, which one is me? What is it? Which one?
I have had people tell me, oh, I bet I know who that is. Yeah, they guess that it's somebody, and they're wrong. Yeah.
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 It's an interesting how people perceive themselves and how they perceive other people, and no one ever sees themselves the way you see them.
No. And it's, you don't see, I don't look like me when I pass a mirror sometimes. I think, God, who is that? Jeez. Oh, man.
So, Christy, do you have a favorite refuge? Or is that a bad question?
That's a bad question, Steve, because honestly, I have something wonderful at every one of them. And honestly, it goes back to the people. I will tell you that I'll just say it this way, for half my career, I was very fortunate to work with some absolutely stellar people, and I worked for some absolutely stellar bosses. For more than half my career, it made it all worthwhile. Some of those crummier ones just kind of faded in the distance. I'll just put it that way. And politics being what they are, I hope I can keep writing about refuges, because I know people are kind of afraid to talk sometimes.
I'm sure. And I asked that favorite what refuge question. I read one time somewhere, I'm sure it was on social media, they said Death Valley was the worst national park. And first off, I love Death Valley. Gwen and I have been out there like a million times because we live so close. But also, just like you said, every one has a redeeming value. That you should love it and cherish it separately from the other ones.
Yeah. I mean, some people would go to Death Valley and think, oh my God, but it is so stark and it just sort of bears your soul when you're there. I'm not sure you see the park as much as you might see humanity at some level. You just discover different things about yourself and about everything, I think, when you... I guess the thing that I can say is that each one, as I said, has its beauty. And one of the things I found the most compelling when I was in Nevada was that sense of closeness to nature, but also being entirely alone in it. Yeah, it's you can go out into the desert there, and if it weren't for a jet flying over from the NTTR sometime, you can imagine that you're the last person on Earth.
Yeah,
and you can think about that.
You get that good quiet.
The book that is coming out next is called Shining Water, and I'll just tell you this real quick. I had named it The Big Empty, kind of tongue-in-cheek, because I'm fully aware that when you step into Nevada, there's nothing empty about that state. And I made my husband stop on I-15 before we got into Las Vegas. And we got out and stood next to the car, and I said, I want you to look out there. You're looking at least 250 different species of plant, period. There's that kind of diversity there. Some of it's incredibly small. You may never see some of it, but it's there. You get into that desert and you are in a land of diversity. And it's like a wonder world of biology. It's geology and biology and everything is so cool. That's why I know it's not the Big Empty. But my publisher said that's a lousy name. We can't use it. And I said, well, I was going to call the book Paranagit, but I don't think anyone could pronounce that. And she goes, no, I don't think so. And I said, it means shining water. She goes, there, we'll take that. So I said, okay.
Yeah,
so the book will be called Shining Water.
Oh, cool. Well, I look forward to that. Christy, well, so I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate you interviewing me. You're the very first podcast I've ever done.
Well, you did very well, and it was a pleasure speaking with you.
Christy, well, thank you very much. We look forward to the next book.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve.
Broadcasting from the Mesquite Works Steam Center in the scenic Mojave Desert, the Art Box sponsors thank you for listening. You can find us on Spotify, Samsung, iHeartRadio, Podchaser, and Amazon Music. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We are on Facebook and Instagram as The Art Box. We welcome all comments. You can email us at artboxvv@gmail.com. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of its hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of our sponsors.